Welcome everyone to Climate Week and to the Air Miners Climate Week event. My name is Jason Grillo. I'm the event director for Air Miners, and I wanted to say that this is going to be a fantastic event. Today, we as Air Miners have the goal in mind of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And in light of that mission, we have some excellent innovators in the field to showcase their past achievements, think about what the state of the art looks like today, and think through what the future holds. The idea is for you as audience members to come away with a sense of some of the interesting stories that our panelists can provide to us all, and to think through how that might inspire us to new heights. So that in mind, again, these are very interesting times for the carbon removal field, with Amazon funding Carbon Cure and Pachama, which is Diego Saez Giles' company. Hello, Diego. And also the Shopify announcement recently, where many different companies are going to be funded through Shopify. And to that end, we're actually going to have an Air Miners event about that in a week's time. So with that, thank you all for coming again, and I will hand it over to Giles from Verge to take it from here, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Jason and Tito, for assembling this amazing panel and for inviting me to moderate. It's a real privilege. So my name is Jim Giles. I'm the food and carbon analyst at GreenBiz, and among other things, I'm the conference chair for Verge Carbon, which is a carbon removal conference coming up quite soon. I've been working and thinking about carbon removal for a couple of years now, and it has been such a privilege to see the sector build real momentum. And it's great to have a panel of people who are really at the heart of that building momentum in the sector. I'm not going to go on. I want to dive straight in and have the panel talk about the amazing work they're doing. So I'll just go around and won't introduce everyone one by one. I'm just going to go around, invite the panel to introduce themselves, and just spend a couple of minutes talking about your story and how you're involved in carbon removal. So Aaron, let's kick off with you.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Jason and Tito and the greater Air Miners community for hosting me again. It's nice to be here, and happy Climate Week New York. I'm Aaron Fitzgerald. As some of you guys may know, I'm an entrepreneur in residence for Carbon 180. I'm also a fellow with the newly minted NREL Lab Start program. As part of my fellowships, I'm investigating carbon capture and reutilization technologies that have the potential to remove a gigaton of carbon dioxide or equivalents using market-based approaches. I have a background in B2B commercialization, so I'm specifically interested in supply chain applications for any end product that's created. And in addition to some of my work in climate restoration, I'm really passionate about ensuring that the foundation of the carbon removal industry is built upon principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I really look forward to that. And then also just thank you for the Air Miners community from our last event. I put a call out for a chemical engineer partner, and I was able to find one from the group. So his name is Christian, and he's been really great. So thank you all, and I look forward to this conversation today.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Kristin, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Echoing Aaron, thanks so much to the Air Miners team for having us again, and happy Climate Week. I am in New York City and was just sort of talking to the panelists before we started about how the Union Square clock is interesting for Climate Week, but you know, I'm looking forward to sharing some optimism rather than a 7-year countdown clock here today. So that's kind of my approach. I'm a little more optimistic. So like Aaron, I am an entrepreneur in residence with Carbon 180 and also a fellow with the NREL Lab Start program. And with the support of these organizations, I've been spending the last few months working to research and understand emerging carbon capture technologies, the emerging market, people who are putting funding into the space. My primary goal has been finding opportunities for new company formation and tech commercialization at the intersection of biotechnology and carbon removal. And this is because I have a background in it's pretty broad, but in biochemistry, consumer biotechnology, and most recently in a high growth open source hardware startup that serves life scientists around the world. And so broadly, I'm interested in looking at ways that we can harness principles of bioengineering to either utilize carbon dioxide to make compounds and materials that we're interested in that we like plastics, like food. And the other involves borrowing from nature's toolkit. So things like biomineralization, right, which has been responsible for moving some 70,000 gigatons of CO2 from the early atmosphere to the oceans and then to the lithosphere over, the last 500 million years. I think there are potentially interesting things that we can borrow from nature's toolkit and enhance an industrial context to really pull a lot of carbon out of the air. So those are some of the things I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in how we can build these technologies such that there is more equitable access to CO2 as a resource for building a new economy and kind of bringing everyone along with us. So really happy to be here, and thanks so much. I'm really excited to talk to everybody.
Thanks, Kristin, and thanks for mentioning the issue of equity. We'll come back to that later in the session, but let's continue the intros. Annie, let's hear from you.
Hi, my name is Anirudh Sharma. I am the co-founder and CEO of Gravity Labs and a research affiliate and a graduate of MIT Media Lab. So what we do, a lot of work in Boston right now is around a lot of work around carbon removal in general. One of our first areas of work has been around looking at carbon particulate matter as a resource. And in the sense, after essentially mining carbon as a resource, what we've also done is we've been very fortunate to be at the center of a lot of creative community and a lot of printing community that wants to use our output material. So we turn air pollution, PM 2.5 into inks and pigments that is used by a lot of printing community out there. And what I would like to share today talk about is how collaboration between different disciplines can yield very powerful results. And when you break out of your silo of being a scientist or being a designer and being just an engineer, when you bring everything together, how very powerful change-making kind of narratives can be built. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Alexsandra, let's hear from you.
Hi, I'm Alexsandra Guerra from Nori. I'm one of the co-founders and director of corporate development there. We're a carbon removal marketplace. So we were founded in October of 2017. Tomorrow we'll be announcing some good news. We'll be able to grow our team, close a current round of funding. And we've been working the past 3 years just trying to build a marketplace for all types of carbon removal, but we've been focused on regenerative agriculture, so trying to get farmers paid for the additional carbon sequestration, the carbon that they store in their soils as a result of adopting new practices. It's been a challenge because, creating a carbon market requires lots of coordination between external experts, internal development of methodologies, getting pilot participants, and it's a two-sided marketplace. So we have kind of a chicken and egg problem, which is where's the supply that the buyers ask, and then the suppliers are like, where are the buyers? So it's an interesting challenge, but part of what we've also done is we have a Reversing Climate Change and Carbon Removal Newsroom podcast that we host every week with my colleague Ross, and it's been a really great way to share information about carbon removal. And I think right now what's at top of mind is there's so many more participants than there were 3 years ago when we started this, and it's just ever growing. So it's really nice to see all the new ideas that are coming out, and we're very curious to see how we can collaborate and start to specialize in the ecosystem and start helping each other out.
Awesome, thank you. And then last up, Diego.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. My name is Diego Saez Gil. I am co-founder of a startup called Pachama, and our focus is on the power that forest and nature in general has as a source of carbon removal. What we do particularly is to harness the latest on remote sensing, satellite images, LiDAR, and artificial intelligence to be able to measure what is the carbon sequestration that happens in forest, and then be able to monitor how that evolves over time. And with that data, we help bring more trust into existing frameworks for forest carbon crediting, and use that data to give more trust to corporate buyers that are investing and pledging to invest heavily into carbon removal and nature-based solutions. And not only are we sort of like validating and monitoring these projects and connecting corporate buyers with forest projects from around the world, but we really hope to help originate thousands of more projects. If we are going to solve climate change, we really need to harness the 1 billion hectares available for forest restoration. And our ultimate goal is to help drive the funding necessary to start this mass forest conservation and restoration movement. And super excited for this community. I love the diversity that we're seeing here, and the momentum that is growing around carbon removal. So thank you.
Thanks, Diego. And I'm not sure which of the panelists, but someone mentioned reasons for optimism, which was good to hear. So 2020 has been a tough year with the pandemic, the wildfires. I live in San Francisco, so I feel very close to them. We've also seen a continued rollback of environmental regulations. It has been a really, really tough year. But I know from talking to people in this community that there is so much energy and optimism out there. So I just want to invite everyone on the panel to do two things. Tell me about something that you're super excited about that's coming up soon for your organization, and give us a flavor for how this community, air miners in general, and the folks who are watching right now can get involved in that. Who are you looking for? What kind of skills? And if it's not particularly, if you're not hiring or you don't need someone immediately, where are the other opportunities for people who want to get involved with the thing that's making you excited? And let's do this in reverse order. So Diego, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned everything that's going on, and in my case was very close. My home burned down to the California fires. I lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and a month ago, I came back from a camping trip, and my house was ashes. So very close to me. And yet I feel very hopeful. I feel that this year, 2020, is a huge wake-up call for the entire planet. And I do see how this wake-up call is galvanizing support. Yesterday, China announced their pledge to be carbon neutral, which is huge. And we're going to see more corporations, more governments, and more individuals taking action. Also, we announced last week that Amazon invested in our company. So it's been really a roller coaster in my life the last few weeks. But I do think that, yeah, there are many reasons to be hopeful. There are many ways to get involved. At Pachama, we're hiring, so do visit our About Us page and reach out to me. My email is d@pachama if you want to get involved. And I'm also seeing new investors wanting to invest in climate tech startups. So there's also plenty of opportunities to start your own company, and then volunteer to organizations to do activism. Even though we are all still at home because of COVID, I think we can do virtual activism, and yeah, just lots of ways that we can act.
Thanks, Diego, and thanks for sharing that story. It's so powerful. I do encourage everyone to read the piece that Diego wrote on Medium that Tito just shared the link. It's really sort of saddening but inspiring at the same time. Okay, Alexsandra, tell us what you're excited about that's coming up at Nori. You sort of hinted at something there. Maybe you can why don't you just tell us now? I'm sure there's no embargo.
I might get a slap on the wrist from Paul, our CEO.
Oh, don't worry about it.
I'm going to do a huge press release about this tomorrow, so keep it in the community for today. But yeah, we were able to close our current fundraising round, which means we'll be able to hire people. So our posts are up at nori.com/careers. Please check them out. They are a senior software engineer. We're going to hire 2. We're going to hire 2 supply account managers in agriculture. So these will be people who are working with the farmers to enroll their data and create a project for them to get paid for their additional carbon sequestration. And then we'll also be hiring a UX designer as well, but that's not up yet. Just stay tuned. If you also just want to keep in touch and keep track of what other positions we'll be hiring for, just subscribe to our newsletter at our website. In addition to hiring, I think something that's really exciting for us, and when I mentioned collaboration before, there are so many different ways that so many different stakeholders in carbon removal, right? And when Nori or anyone designs a marketplace, there are different actors. So you have suppliers, buyers, and you have independent verifiers, different types of project developers, data managers, etc. So, oh, and then the one I was going to touch on is what we call the carbon quantification tool. So this is a third-party tool that we plug into because we're a marketplace. It would be a conflict of interest if we were the tool by which we were estimating how much CO2 was being removed on our suppliers' farms. So we partner with a third-party tool. This one is called Comet Farm, COMET-farm, and it's a USDA-funded tool. It's what the US government uses to estimate how many greenhouse gases are being contributed on a global level from the croplands in US. So it's very credible, but we need to see more of that. So when we're talking about we want to build a marketplace where people can plug in and pay for carbon removal from all different spaces, one thing that I love to talk about is we need anyone who has a fun idea about developing some type of open source tool that transparently estimates how much carbon is being removed by certain projects like mangrove restoration. That's my personal favorite. Those are really exciting things that we would love to talk about and would love to see in the Nori marketplace. And I think it's just better to continue to develop these things in an open source manner, but still, we all create complementary business models so that we can continue to grow the market.
Great, and congratulations, Alexsandra. That sounds great. Really excited to hear that you got that next round. Let's go over to Annie. Tell us what's happening, what you're excited about in your world and how people can get involved with it.
Yeah, thanks, James. So like till now, we have been a material science company, which is moving a lot of materials. So we were dealing with a lot of physical form of pollution, such as this. Like if you see on the camera, this is like I don't know if because of the lighting you'll be able to see, but this is like literally the visual form of carbon emissions that you are otherwise breathing in when you are out there. So we were dealing with this material in tons of it. And because of COVID, our supply chain has kind of been compromised. So the scale at which we were functioning and planning on scaling this up, they're not able to do that primarily because hiring and building teams that work in big physical localities has become kind of very hard. And that's where the whole idea came in the direction that we are kind of nudging in, is the exact use cases of what we're trying to do. So what we do is actually we transform this type of emissions into different forms of ink, such as the one that you see in my hand. That's like 180 minutes worth of emissions from a diesel car. And what we are trying to do right now is instead of positioning ourselves as a heavy materials company, which becomes extremely hard as a startup, we're trying to change the positioning to becoming a sustainability commerce play, like just a play on the word e-commerce. We're trying to become a S-commerce play. We're trying to build a platform that kind of bridges the physical impact, which is the material impact, and the carbon removal, tangibly reducing that impact by creating new products with these pre-offsetted materials, but also creating a digital layer on top. Just as the previous speaker was talking about, a digital layer on top that when we are selling these materials out in the market, like for example, this t-shirt that is printed with the same ink that you see. So the overall carbon footprint of the t-shirt, how much it has been impacted based on where it's being shipped, where the materials are being sourced from, how do we build that digital layer on top? So we're doing a lot of API work on that right now. So kind of in that positioning of pivoting our startup from being just a material company into becoming both material and data company together, because that's one good direction that you can start thinking about during COVID times. So one is that, and one thing, so this is super exciting because it opens up very wide consumer market streams for us. For example, apparel. So how can we start addressing apparel industry by using S-commerce? And the platform is being built right now. So we're looking for support, especially on hiring people around who have had experience on building apparel companies. So our team is mostly material science and people who deal with carbon capture as such. But yeah, that's the direction that we are going in. S-commerce, super excited, and would love to chat with anybody who sees themselves like contributing to something like this. Yeah.
Thank you. And you know, one thing I find so interesting about this is it reminds me of a report that Carbon 180 put out, I think probably 2 years ago now, and I highly recommend people reading it if you haven't already, which looked at the total market for products based on captured carbon. And that is such an eye-opener, that report, because the breadth of things that we could make using carbon that we pull down from the atmosphere is really incredible. And what we're starting to see is the emergence of real products. And so, Annie, it's so great to hear this story about just like filling in one more bit in this jigsaw of things that we could make in a way that creates a circular carbon economy. It's super exciting. Okay, let's finish off the reasons for optimism, and let's go to Kristin and then Aaron.
First of all, congratulations to Nori and your products, and Diego, very inspiring. I'm like so much more excited to be here after hearing all of you talk about what you're excited about. I have a very long list of things that I could go on and on about. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I've been seeing in this space since I entered is just, despite the absence, which Jim alluded to, of US federal leadership on global climate and carbon removal initiatives, I think it's really heartening to see, for instance, China making a commitment to reduce their emissions by 2060, and seeing large corporations like Shopify and Amazon and Microsoft come in and start really putting up money and buying from companies that are already in the space, and other large investment groups really starting to put money towards this and say, okay, we really need to actually support the people that are moving into this space early and taking on a lot of the risk that's associated with trying to pull together new marketplaces, new platforms, new technologies all at the same time. And Jim alluded to this jigsaw concept. And I think one of the things that I'm super optimistic about is, you know, I come from tech. There's a lot of ego in tech. There's surprisingly quite a bit less ego in this space. And I love that, because everyone is working so hard and every single person sees themselves as one piece of this bigger picture. You know, we're not really looking for silver bullets. We're looking to say yes and seeing this as a greenfield opportunity and a place where, you know, multiple people can come in and have access and win and thrive and build a better future together. And just seeing the people in this room today, like, I'm very excited about the number of people that are here and are listening to us talk, and kind of participating in this conversation. So those are my two main things. I also think, so things that I'm looking for are, I mean, I'm looking for people who want to build a team with me. I'm not even hiring a team. I'm in the phase where I'm thinking about, how am I going to find co-founders to help build around some of the ideas that I'm excited about? So I'm looking to meet bioengineers, people who know things about manufacturing, people who know things about cement, and the building industry, particularly interested in, like I said, borrowing some of nature's toolkit to help create living materials and sequester carbon in the built environment. So looking for that. Also just looking for people to give me advice. I know there are a lot of people in here that have been in this field for a lot longer than I have. And so I love hearing about people's experience and just connecting with people and broadening my network and my awareness of everything that's going on in the space. So yeah, that's me. I'm very excited about a lot of things, but.
Thanks, Kristin. That's great to hear. Aaron, you wrap it up for this question.
Yeah, sure. I think the panel has said a lot, and just kind of piggybacking off of Kristin in terms of ego, My partner last week was posting, a couple weeks ago when we were in the midst of those wildfire smokes in California. His Twitter account was kind of full of, "We can't breathe. It's very hard to breathe." And one thing that's really inspiring about what we're doing here is that we're trying to get out of that. You don't have opportunity to think about ego when you're trying to, survive. So I'm really inspired by this community for being here. I think there's over 100 people on this call right now, and that's amazing. Particularly for me, I'm in the middle of a technology review, and daily, and when you're thinking about technology and commercializing it, there are a bunch of factors that go into it, from commercialization and capitalization to building a team. And what feels like daily, I'm seeing developments and announcements from governments around the world that are showing that there's support for folks like me. We heard about China from the other panelists. Norway also announced Project Loanship, which is an initiative to invest $1.8 billion into a carbon capture plant at a cement facility in the country. Also, I read, we're in partnership with the national labs, and I see daily all the technology that's coming out of there, particularly in the area of integrated carbon capture and utilization. And there's a lot of opportunity for that, because when you think about these technologies, they need commercialization work, they need other forms of validation, and ideally they need a champion to move them from market to lab, from lab to market. So when I think about how other air miners can get involved, there are a bunch of pathways nowadays. There's the Carbon 180 Entrepreneur Residence Fellowship, if you want to kind of be the champion for some of these. But if you want to just join a team and not necessarily a startup, there's a whole industry that we have to develop. And when you think about industries, you have the business of being in business in addition to the market itself. And that requires work and people and talent. And we need a talent pipeline developed and built. And we need rules in terms of regulatory to change to make this work easy. That requires people on the outside and the inside making that change, in addition to some other on-ramps for entrepreneurs to connect with potential customers and industry. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we're just kind of starting that foundation. So I would say, get in where you fit in, and if you don't feel like you fit in, just kind of do it.
That should be our motto. That's brilliant, Aaron. Thank you. So I'm going to ask 2 more questions to the panel, and then I want to take questions from the audience, but don't wait. Start putting them in chat, and I'll try and do a filter there. And so my next question is really about looking further ahead. So all of the technologies that we've talked about today, I think, are basically happening right now. They're pretty much proven, and they're going on. They're either like on the market or entering the market. Let's look further ahead. Let's speculate. And I'd love to hear about technologies that are unproven. Maybe they're still in the lab, or there just isn't a clear business case, but that you are super excited about. Something that maybe will be coming to the market 5 or 10 years from now, but could make a really big impact. I'm not going to go all around the panel one by one. I just invite panelists jump in and tell us quickly about those technologies.
Yeah, so I guess I'm kind of at the ground level here. I'm particularly interested in utilization technologies, and having the opportunity to partner with NREL and other national labs, I get some good insight into what's being developed. When it comes to my philosophy for the best utilization method, I look for fast-growing markets that and niche markets inside of those that can sustain a higher cost. But what we're seeing out of some of the labs are technologies like electrocatalysis that can do CO2 reduction into things like carbon monoxide, which can be used for syngas and other utilization opportunities. There's also technologies that can create more renewable, like ethylene, which is pretty exciting. It's one of the, I believe that market itself is about $150 billion and growing. So you think about all the uses for some of these base chemicals and how they fit into the supply chain. You have this opportunity to essentially remake how our world functions and operates on a materials level. And then lastly, it's not directly related to specific atmospheric reduction of carbon dioxide, but you're talking about decarbonization and using new materials that can also do things like reduce indirect scope emissions. There are technologies that allow for more efficient production and renewable production of carbon fiber. That's really exciting to me.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And I think you were perfectly placed to answer that because of the technology review. Where should we go to learn more about that review? Are you planning on publishing it, for example?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I would love to be able to create some type of framework that allows others to also review technologies and make it easier to kind of jump in, so you don't have to go through the grueling process that I've had to do to learn all this stuff. And if I'm able to get to that point, then I would happily do that. And maybe we can, and I think that's going to take a lot of feedback from folks on this panel and other folks in the audience. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to shoot me a message. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and via email.
Thank you. Okay, so back to the more speculative technologies. Who else from the panel wants to jump in with some suggestions?
So I'm in a similar position that Aaron is in, where I've been sort of reviewing a bunch of technologies. I've recently narrowed my focus pretty significantly. I think I've gotten really excited and decided some of the areas that I want to work on. But, I think some of the more speculative stuff that I've seen that's not even necessarily ripe for commercialization right now, but are things that people are thinking about on the biotechnology and bioengineering side specifically, aside from the utilization things, which are all really, really interesting, right? So you've got Coverti and Air Protein and Novo Nutrients that are already operating at scale and are making different types of food or fish feed or things like that from industrial point source carbon. I think those are really interesting. I think there are a lot of additional things that are coming through that pipeline. A lot of work being done with cyanobacteria, using cyanobacteria to produce food additives, using cyanobacteria to produce polyurethane foams, I think is a really big niche. A few exciting companies in that space and a whole lot of ground left to cover there. Also really excited about some of the more speculative stuff. So, been working with a group that's thinking about things like, sort of supercharging photosynthetic organisms. So one of the problems with cyanobacteria is they grow pretty slow, and it takes a lot of land area to actually grow a lot of cyanobacteria. So people working on better photobioreactors and people working on enhancing photosynthetic pathways, or borrowing some of those pathways and putting them into faster growing organisms so they can use more CO2. There's also a few sort of concepts that I mentioned around biomineralization. There's some really interesting stuff going on with direct air capture. Currently, one of my favorite groups is the Open Air Collective. It's a group that's working on open source, small footprint direct air capture using moisture swing sorbents. We get together once a month and just hack on hardware using ion exchange resin that we buy from Sigma Aldrich, and try to figure out, is it possible to make a personal use direct air capture machine? Is that a thing that A, we can build and make open source, and B, then is it a thing that maybe somebody would want to park outside of their greenhouse? Or is it something that we can get designers and artists and programmers and mechanical engineers to come in and help with? So I'm also really excited about that kind of broad community effort around open source hardware. My problem is I'm excited about everything. So if I'm speculating about the future, honestly, my biggest answer to that is I think that I'm hoping that in, I don't know, as short of a time frame as possible, that we're making a lot of the materials that we currently make with petrochemicals, which is just ancient fossilized biology, with new biology, with new, more renewable biomass feedstocks. So that is kind of the direction that I am the most excited about. Sorry, that was a ramble, but.
Thank you. I invited you to be excited and optimistic, so thank you for doing so. Let's have one more speculative technology before we go on to the next question. And Alexsandra put her hand
I
up.
want to push on this question because I've been wanting to answer it, but then you put speculative in there. And I'm just like, well, what technologies are excited about in the next 5 to 10 years? And if you take out the word speculative, I'd love to say, you know, more technologies and more companies like the ones Diego, that Pachama is, you know, we have so many existing methods, natural ways to sequester and store carbon, people wanting to pay for that, but very little understanding on how to measure that and verify that. And we need to see a lot more improvement on how to measure and verify that, not just within forestry like Pachama, but also within agriculture, within, you know, the oceans. So I would love to see, and we need to see more technologies to help with the monitoring, measuring, and verification of natural occurring carbon sequestration, because that way we can continue to monetize that and get people paid for not just industrially removing carbon, which is useful and we can put into products, but also restoring the planet and its health that we live on.
That is a great point. Thank you. I think it's easy to forget that any new technology or any technology that scales is surrounded by a whole sort of ecosystem of related technologies that allow it to really flourish and come to market in a big way. And so for the work you're doing, yeah, totally, we need cheap, fast soil carbon measurements that we can deploy at scale. So yeah, very excited to see what happens there. One more question and I'm going to go to the audience questions. I want to just quickly think about equity. We are trying to create a new industrial sector here. We want it to be absolutely huge. We want to draw down gigatons of carbon every year. But we know from the history of technology that technologies can deploy at scale in ways that are unjust. There is no guarantee that if we create this new sector, it will do anything to enhance inclusion or do anything to address some of the other inequalities that we care about. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us that are trying to drive this forward to think about how we can scale it in a way that's just. This is a tricky thing. I think it's a thing in this community we're only just beginning to think about, but I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly Diego and Alexsandra, because I think in terms of like getting your technology out there onto the market, you're the furthest forward on the panel. So would either of you like to jump in on that?
Sure, yeah, I can comment on that. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential that this is kept in mind by policymakers and by us, entrepreneurs and technology makers who are deploying solutions. In our case in particular, as it happens, the forest countries are in developing nations, which are the ones who contributed the least to the CO2 that we have in the atmosphere and who are the ones who will suffer the most from climate change. So I think that in driving funding from the polluting countries and corporations to the countries that can restore and conserve forests, we are doing both. We are removing CO2 and we're driving funding to support the livelihood of communities that will be facing the challenges of climate change. It is super important though that these frameworks consider community involvement and in a very transparent way effectively drive capital to those communities. In some cases indigenous communities, in other cases it's just local communities of farmers who take care of the forest. And yeah, I always like to say that the real revolution that humanity needs is kind of like a spiritual revolution. It's the revolution of values. We have the technologies and we have the means to build a sustainable circular economy. It's just a matter of deciding to do it. So in Silicon Valley, where we like to talk about technologies and bits and bytes, I think it's also important to talk about values.
And to build on what Diego said, I mean, technology at the end of the day is just a tool. And it relies on people to use it. And so there's also the human aspect of all this. So, tech is amazingly powerful, but at the end of the day, it comes down to really individual action.
Thank you, both of you. Alexsandra, do you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I do my claps already. Diego and I talk about this sometimes. It is definitely more than the technology aspect. It's a people and planet issue. It's like people, spirit, and technology, because I believe science and tech is just a means for us to be here. And if we're not addressing what's really going on inside, like why do we continuously look for things to be more convenient? And why do we continuously look to consume more? If we don't address those things, we will continue to consume more, continue to contribute more CO2 to the atmosphere, and then just find ourselves in this constant puzzle of like, how do we clean up our mess enough and while we're consuming this thing. So unfortunately, I don't think that's within the context of this, but I'm really glad that you brought it up, Diego.
Yeah, thanks, Alexsandra. That actually brings me to a question that we had come in by email that I'll turn to now. But just to remind everyone, do add your questions to the chat. We've got about just over 15 minutes to address them. So we had one come in by email ahead of the session that I thought was super interesting. And the person was asking, how can the work we do in carbon removal benefit individuals? And initially this kind of threw me, and I was like, well, you know, what are we talking about? We're just dealing with climate change, you know, it's all in this together and trying to draw down greenhouse gases. But I think there's an interesting point here in that there's often a disconnect. People do often think like, why should I care about doing all this drawdown stuff when it just sort of seems irrelevant to my life and there's China going on polluting, you know? And I think there's a point here about making a connection between the work that we're doing and individuals' lives and the impact it has on them. And I'm curious as to whether anyone on the panel has thought through that, particularly with a view to, you know, the marketing of the products and services that you're creating. Annie, maybe you would be a good person to address that.
Yeah, I was thinking about like answering this when you just said like when China goes on polluting. So I live around like I'm in India right now, and I'm around an extremely industrialized city from all the four sides, and it's like literally factories polluting and consuming a lot of fossil fuels all around the year. And when that individual questions come that what about these factories polluting all around the year? What about China polluting all around the year? I think they're polluting because we are consuming. So I think that pollution is very much tied to our consumption. And as an individual, I think the way to start is to start thinking about at least being more accepting towards the new ideas that are coming out in the market that, hey, we are talking about the climate impact of these products that are being presented to us. So which one to choose? So that choice of conscious consumption, I think is really powerful. And I think that's the easiest way as a consumer, as an individual, you can like start taking these initiatives in your own lives, like the regular sustainability initiatives that small changes that people start making. And these speculative technologies that like a lot of us are working on right now, they'll take their time to become democratized. Until the time I think that democratization happened, there's a very powerful power in our hands to choose things that are made the right way, or at least that those kind of values have gone in engineering those materials. And previously, I think you were talking about like, you know, the point of values. I strongly believe that like 5 years ago, when you were taught how to 3D print a material, for example, like a basic engineering thing that you're taught in engineering school, that nobody used to think about, like we were never taught that when you're 3D printing something, what kind of material you're using to 3D print with, what happens to this material afterwards. And now, slowly, we can see this conversation shift in academia and in maker spaces that people are talking about. Can we 3D print with material that is less wasteful? Or can we start thinking about materials that what happens after the end of life of that material? So I think that's a good way, in my opinion, that a lot of people would agree that, like, you know, it's a really simple way for us, not even as technologists, that, you know, we can start taking these small initiatives in our lives. Yeah.
Thanks, Annie. Anyone else want to jump in on that before we move to the next question?
I will just say, I think COVID has really shown us that, you know, individual action does matter, and we're really all in this together. And, you know, climate change, yes, you can blame other people, you can blame China, you can blame corporations, but at the end of the day, the only behavior you can influence is your own behavior. You know, so it's really up to each of us individually to step up and say, what can I do in my life? You know, where's my carbon footprint coming from primarily, and just educating yourself about that. Because yeah, I mean, it's really, you know, individual action will save us.
I have a comment.
Fire away.
My name is Joe James, and our company is ATPMD LLC. We've been selected by the Exelon Foundation's Climate Change Initiative to essentially deliver a process that we have that both captures CO2 and provides other environmental services that are beneficial. And it's those other environmental services that impact the community, particularly inner city residents in Baltimore, as we clean up brownfield sites that are impacting them using the biocrops that we use to capture CO2. And we also, in the news lately, there's been an acknowledgement that COVID-19 is airborne. And we believe that it's, some research has shown that it's not only airborne in water droplets on their own, but also there's some science that suggests that the virus is also airborne on airborne particulate matter. And that airborne particulate matter, unfortunately, quite often swamps communities of color and causes preconditions like asthma and other respiratory diseases, so that when COVID-19 comes, it's much more severe and more deadly. So the summary point I'm making is that the CO2 capture technologies that are used can also have additional environmental and health and even social impacts on communities that have in the past been the ones that suffered the most for climate change and other environmental impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think that's a really good point. And I encourage you, Joe, and everyone else, if you want to highlight work you're doing, just drop a link in the chat. That is the best way to do it, given we have a pretty full panel and only a few minutes left. But that's actually a really nice move into a question that came in from chat from Leanne, who's asking or making the example that plastic was invented to replace billiard balls, which were originally made with ivory. And is the panel concerned that using this new science and technology, we might engineer ourselves into a new and even worse problem? And I kind of like this question because I think we do need to be honest with ourselves and within the community about the things that could go wrong. You know, we are talking about developing a major new industrial sector here, and we're very clear about the benefits in terms of drawdown, but what are the things that are on the horizon that worry you? How could we do this in a way that could end up having negative side effects?
Yeah, I'll say, as someone looking at growth beachhead markets, I, would hope in terms of like my entrepreneurial endeavors that I would be a sole supplier and leveraging a technology that uses CCU. But one issue that you have there is you have a growing industry, but the change doesn't necessarily happen in the kind of legacy industries. And there's definitely that result, that potentiality, and the stress there, I think, is really what I said towards the beginning of this conversation. Is it's not just technology that's the solution to this. We also need folks on the policy and the regulatory side influencing and really talking to our leaders in the US and around the world who are aging rapidly and care less about this than we do, to really help them understand what the change needs to happen and how to wind down some of the existing industries that we have. I don't really think it's possible to prevent some of the externalities that may happen and some of the other co-benefits or co-challenges that may come up from this technology. But right now we're in a crisis, and that crisis needs to be addressed. And if that means that there are some other benefits that we have to solve down the road, if we're able to solve this issue, I think we can solve those.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Aaron. I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind for me is this thing that, I've heard said in a few different places, but it's like, when you invent the plane, which was an amazing technology, you also invented the plane crash, right? Like sometimes the things that we create and the problems that are created by them, actually almost all the time, those come hand in hand. It's really difficult to anticipate ahead of time all of the problems that could arise from the technologies that we're creating. But this is explicitly why discussions of carbon removal approaches, just to piggyback on Aaron's point, they can't be merely technical, they have to be explicitly political. And in my mind, there are two reasons for this. First, I think taking a default approach to carbon removal technology under the existing power structures that we have, will risk further harm to frontline communities and ecosystems, the exact communities and ecosystems that are most likely to be harmed by this. And they might not end up removing the climate significant amounts of carbon that we want. And so this is also where things like what Nori is doing, things like what Pachama is doing, this is where all of these things become very important. And it becomes important to not just think about this along technological axes, but think about it as sort of an ecosystem of things that we're building together in order to try to save the planet, try to help people, but that necessitates a certain amount of engagement. It requires us to be really intentional about diversity, equity, inclusion while we're building these things. It requires us to really go out and interface with people that, like, you know, if you're building a technology, you might go out and do a whole bunch of customer interviews and not really talk to that many other people. We need to be talking to everyone as much as possible about what we're building and why, and really listening to people's concerns about it. And one of my, I'll just say this, another thing that I've really loved in terms of a framework for this is there are plenty of people that write about this specific thing who are much smarter than I am and have spent their entire lives thinking about exactly this kind of relation between like technology and the socio-political. But with respect to thinking about carbon removal, I particularly enjoy Holly Jean Buck's work. There's an essay that she wrote it's something like Decolonizing the Air, I think is, I don't know what the exact title of it, but if you key in her name and that search term, it should come up. And then, yeah, there are several other books and articles that I could recommend, but really there's a lot of like conversation and listening that has to go on, and we have to be prepared for this to also be a very political conversation. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but.
No, thank you. So we're fast running out of time, and I'm looking at the stuff that's coming through in the chat. Oh, well, there's a note from Tito there who's just pointing out that we will have breakout rooms when we hit 1 o'clock Pacific. So if you want to stay around and keep talking, please do so. I have to jump off. Maybe some of the other panelists do, but the conversation will continue here. So Justin, there's also some stuff in the chat about how do you talk about this work? I love that. And Marcus Extevor from the X Prize, I can see him weighing in with some great suggestions. I want to hear very, very quickly from each panelist. You're at a party, someone comes up to you, they find out you're working in carbon dioxide removal and they go, huh? What's that? Why should I care about it? And you have like 1 minute to convince them that they should really care about it. What do you tell them?
I'll go for it. Recently, talking to family and people who are not in the space at all. It's more like, well, you don't have to have the conversation about climate change being an issue. Most people understand that. So now like we can bypass that, and that doesn't take up the minute. And the minute's like, well, climate change is an issue of too much CO2 in the atmosphere when we drive our cars, when we fly planes, etc. So let's just clean up our mess. But we have to have someone do it. People aren't just gonna start picking up your trash because they think it's, you know, good for the earth. Maybe some people, but it won't scale. So we need to find better ways to pick up trash, and we need to find better systems for people to get paid for picking up trash. And that's this invisible gas in the air. People go, oh, that's cool. How do you do that? And then that gets to a really long conversation about like, well, there are so many ways you can remove carbon.
I love that one. I think like the analogy of domestic or sorry, residential trash collection is really good, because it's so obvious how awful that would be if it didn't work. So it's a very good starting point for a bigger conversation. Anyone else want to jump in from the panel?
Yeah, sometimes I use analogies to give a sense of dimension and the fact that 1 ton is the size of a house. If you were to imagine a ton of CO2, and you know, when it comes to the forest, you know, that we're losing the size of Belgium per year on tropical forest, and that you know, we at Pachama, for example, already help conserve about 1.9 million soccer fields of tropical rainforest. and trying to use these analogies that give us a sense of what we know, right? Because otherwise these numbers sound big, but very abstract, and we cannot imagine the impact of what we're talking about.
Thanks, Diego. I think we have time for just one more from the panel, if anyone has one.
I think for us, it becomes, so we just show them, like, for example, things made out of carbon, and they ask like, oh, what do you mean by it's made of carbon? Oh, then it goes back. Oh, do you know that you drive this car and how much carbon it releases this much time? So X amount of carbon was utilized to make this product. Oh, how does carbon removal work? And then you make them, oh, there's so much carbon everywhere, and these are the possible technologies. And then people get really curious about carbon removal. So I think that tangibility of carbon, like how it can be touched and felt if it's properly upcycled and utilized, can make people really, really curious about what the backstory of that carbon has been. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all the panelists and to everyone who put in questions. And I'll just hand it back to Jason just to wrap it up before we hit the top of the hour.
All right. Thanks, Jim. And thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for being such a wonderful audience. A lot of excellent ideas coming out of this. I'm feeling inspired for what the future of air miners is and what the future of carbon dioxide removal is based on what we're hearing here. To answer your question, Jim, I always think of putting the idea of carbon dioxide removal in terms of light of climate change, like droughts, fires, floods, hurricanes. What air mining can do is reverse that by removing carbon from the air. Simple, easy way of thinking about it. If you want to be a part of the Air Miners community too, I'd encourage you all to join our Slack group, come to a new event. Our next event is going to be a week from today, talking through participants in the Shopify partnerships that were just announced recently. Alexsandra Guerra is going to be moderator for that. Wonderful discussion. So I encourage you all to look to that email, which will show up in your inbox before the end of the day.